I don't think there's anything that would leave too much more of a dramatic impression than living on the edges of the Sahara in what is a subsistence society with marginal land and marginal resources, and seeing people somehow collectively and individually have and demonstrate and maintain and share the fortitude to carve out a life of some dignity amongst themselves, and then you're going to find in Niger. There's lots of places where I've been that I'd like to go back to. None of them probably had quite the formative impact on my life as Niger had. It's just to go back just seemed like a wonderful opportunity.
After almost 40 years, Jim Schneider was on his way back to Niger, a landlocked country in sub-Saharan Africa. He lived and worked there as a U.S. Peace Corp volunteer. When Jim was there as a young man, things were desolate. He remembers the day he arrived. He boarded a trans-African bus and quickly learned things weren't like North America.
We had to change buses a couple of times because the roads, none of which were paved, had been washed out during the just finishing rainy season. We had to disembark everything from the bus, float it and ourselves across on rafts, reload the bus on the other end, and move on from there. It took us 3 days and 2 nights. We slept on the road the first night. We slept in Maradi the second night and got to Zinder very, very late the third night.
Zinder was not Jim's final destination. He was posted in a small village called Matame, where he worked with a newly formed agricultural co-op. At the time, people thought peanuts might be one of the answers to Niger's desperate economic situation.
Peanuts began to emerge as an industrial crop in the sense that it was a cash crop. It was used for peanut oil locally, it was used for peanut butter locally. The shells were used for fertilizer, so it had uses and it existed already, but there was a major shift towards production of peanuts when a market was found for them internationally.
As a volunteer in a rural village, Jim was witness to the conditions of everyday life in Niger. It's a memory he's never forgotten.
You knew that between the ravages of the illnesses that children get and the effects of malnutrition, that many people and many families lost many children, and that life was precarious even after that, between meningitis and hepatitis and malaria and all the other kind of things that are endemic in a place like Niger.
Since he returned home, Jim's life has moved on. He lives in Quebec. He's raised a family. Niger has moved on too, but not in the way Jim might have hoped when he left the country almost 40 years ago. The peanut industry has collapsed, and another promising resource, uranium, bottomed out with the end of the Cold War.
The main trend I see, it's a whole new awareness for a better standard of living as a responsibility of government. Government was not held accountable in many of the societies. Government was still seen as distant, but now I see NGOs that are dedicated basically to fighting for economic rights.
The last 10 years, Niger was really in a bad situation. Political situation was bad, economic situation was bad, almost the state wasn't existent.
During those 10 years, Niger went from a democratically elected government in 1993 to military coups in 1996 and 1999. It's a history that's all too common in many parts of West Africa.
Military rule and civilian rule is no longer on the cards. It's not acceptable, you know. And there is a shift away from that towards a democracy. And what is becoming a trend now is even in cases where military regimes take over civilian regime, they are quick to present themselves as a transition government.
That's exactly what happened in Niger. After the 1999 coup, the interim military government quickly announced elections that brought Tanja Mamadou to power as president in 2000. But the price of years of military rule has been grave. Not only did large parts of Niger's citizenry become alienated from government, but foreign assistance, Canadian included, disappeared. Conditions in Niger worsened.
You know, Niger is the second country at the end of the list of the United Nations program. No, it's almost the poorest country in the world. So you have to be conscious of that. You know, if you look at that, economic growth, social indicators, etc., etc. In Niger, it goes very bad, and it will get worse and worse and worse.
Au Niger, il y a beaucoup de problèmes majeurs de santé. Le Niger est confronté.
There are major health problems in Niger. Niger is confronted, like all other developing countries, with a poverty problem. And when one says poverty, one actually means the whole series of all those various kinds of diseases. Malnutrition, skin diseases. You have epidemics like meningitis, which attacks our country almost every year.
In a country like Niger, disease means the economy suffers once again.
Le paludisme sévit.
Malaria attacks at one particular time of year in our country. A malaria victim is often paralyzed for weeks and weeks. Unfortunately, malaria hits during the rainy season. And it is during that rainy season that one needs able-bodied people to cultivate the fields, to work the fields, and to pasture animals. And it attacks not only the rural world, but it also attacks the economic engines of society. It hits students, and it hits public employees. Once those people are hit by malaria, they can spend days and weeks in a state of paralysis. So we have a negative effect on our economy, and consequently on the economic and social development of our country.
Niger's weak economy and meager base of natural resources has resulted in little infrastructure development, few paved roads, an almost non-existent air service, no rail service, and unreliable telecommunications further hampers Niger's potential. The population of Niger has boomed during years of drought, famine, and political instability.
Outside of the capital, there's not much happening. Governments have been more interested in building Western-style capital cities rather than evenly distributing the products of economic development. And one of the major effects that has had is that it has alienated rural folks. It has alienated people who are not in the urban center. It has alienated the uneducated. So that there is a gulf in most African society between those usually urban educated elites and the mass of the rural folks who do not have these basic amenities in the rural area. Another implication is that it has led to what has become vast rural-urban migration. A lot of people are leaving the rural areas to the urban areas because that is the only place where they can get good education, electricity, good water, and those basic amenities.
In 1997, Jim accepted an invitation to return to Niger to help mark the 35th anniversary of Peace Corp in Niger. This despite the desperate state of Niger's economy and the unstable political situation. On a visit to the village of Kantash, near Matame, Munzo, the master drum maker, and his family entertained Jim and his other Peace Corps visitors. The trip was short. It didn't allow Jim much time in the places he once worked and lived, but it did rekindle his passion for Niger, and it opened a new door.
Near the end of the trip, when we were back in Niamey, a couple of the women who were on the trip separately, individually, said to me, you know, there's this organization, Friends of Niger, and they query as to whether I'd be interested in getting involved, and I said, well, I might.
When Jim returned home to Canada, he recorded some of his thoughts about his trip.
The thought of the boy with the brass hoop and the stick, sneaking out of Munzo's compound to go play a child's game. And I thought of my grandson, and I thought of Newt's boy, Silas, and I thought of the language. And it seemed to me that there was no reason that those three little boys and other boys and girls like them could not sustain their common language. The language of the very young, the language of equality, the language of mutual respect, if we help them do it.
Jim didn't expect to hear anything further from anyone about Friends of Niger, but he was wrong. Shortly after he returned to Canada, Jim accepted an invitation to join the board of directors of that organization. A year later, he was elected president of an organization determined to respond to the needs of everyday Nigerians.
We want to use our fairly small pool of finances to encourage things that are happening in the local community where we know there's at least a measure of local control and we know where the projects respond to needs identified locally.
Friends of Niger prefers to support activities controlled by local people. Jim knows this means his organization has less control over the activities they support, but he doesn't see that as a problem.
If you're really serious about wanting to encourage local control and local power, if you're really serious about wanting to reinforce the institutions of democracy at the local level, then that's what comes with it. Democracy is a shared power thing. We have some resources they don't have. They're the ones we think could make use of them. At some point you have to turn some of it over and in good faith let people do their best.
Friends of Niger wanted to find a project that would make a significant difference in the lives of Nigerians. In 2000, Jim was contacted by Hawa Diatta, the wife of the Nigerian ambassador to the United States.
We came to feel that if we aspired to be making a contribution at the grassroots level, we could do a lot worse off than make amongst our initial contributions one that was led by someone who was Nigerian, who came from the interior of the country, and whose credibility and ability was very high.
Madame Diatta runs microcredit programs in Niger. She's established a non-profit organization called Microcredit in Africa, or MICA. She's also written a book about the struggle of women in that part of the world called Shadow of Africa. It's her way to make her position as an ambassador's wife meaningful.
I had the opportunity, to work in some village, like to do microcredit, like to really realize what is the development to women.
Madame Diatta's primary focus these days is on Project Oxcart. MICA trains women's cooperatives in the basics of economics and management. It then helps them choose leadership and set rules for their cooperative. Finally, MICA provides the women an ox and cart. That ox cart is used to transport goods to market, as an ambulance, or to meet other needs of the village. The women are able to sell more goods at market, and they can rent out their cart when they aren't using it. This allows them to pay back the cost of the ox cart and hopefully generate savings for the cooperative, which the women then use to improve the standard of life in their villages.
So the fact that we could get involved in some at a grassroots level with women's groups right in the middle of Niger was attractive in and of itself. It's low cost, low maintenance, locally controlled, and by its very nature, sustainable.
The ox cart is microcredit. First, they use the ox cart, then they gain money, then they can start small business. That's why it's micro credit, it's small credit.
For Jim, one of the most important parts of the Ox Cart program is that it deals directly with women.
Well, it matters because there really has been virtually no attempt in the past to either give women access to lines of credit. In a country, in an economy like Niger, and it's not the only example thereof, where resources are scarce, to not even engage half of the country and to not even tap into the potential of half of the country would seem to be like an economic and a developmental disaster.
Amadou Kimba lives in Niger. Though he now lives in the capital city, he grew up in a rural village and agrees the focus on women is important.
It is really more important to work with women than men, because here in our society, most of family business is done by women. If women become rich, everything they win, they spend it for the family, for the life of society. But if it is men, they are going to take another wife. Maybe they are going to drink beer. They are going to take drugs. But they don't spend money to make the quality of the life of the family.
The fact that women don't have a large role in the economy of a country, for example, like Niger, is largely to do with traditional restraints. So the challenge is to get beyond those traditional limitations and the attitudes that come with it.
To get past traditional limitations, Madame Diada must go to the village chief and seek permission to work with the women.
You know, the background, the culture is something which we have since when we are little. So the respect, you know, like of the husband, the respect of the oldest people, the respect of the chief is something which no one in Africa can deny. If I go in the village, I know what I have to do because I have first to go and see the chief and explain to him I am in his village and I want to make some change. Even if the change is good for the village, I have to get his authorization. That part of the culture and that part of the respect which I have for the chief. So I have to do it, and I know that is important for the success of the project. When you empower the women, it means that they have less work to do. After, you know, the project is established, I tell them, you will be economically independent. But on the other hand, I want you to send your daughter to school. So really, the most important thing is to see like more girl going to school, more girl educated. Because there is a proverb saying that, to educate a woman, is just to educate the whole nation. Because the woman is the mother of the nation.
Friends of Niger was on board for Madame Diada's Ox Cart program. While they'd had involvement in other initiatives, Jim felt the Ox Cart program was one that could make a measurable difference. Jim decided it was time to return to Niger. While he'd been there briefly back in 1997, he was about to embark on a tour that would take him back to the villages he once worked in one of the world's poorest countries.
It'll be a combination of nostalgia and I think in a strange kind of way, for me, a way of saying, I meant it when I said I'd be back, but to actually be on the ground and be able to talk to people whose lives it's affecting and have an honest exchange with them, and I know that's the kind of exchange we'll be able to have. So it's part of what I'm looking forward to as well.
Jim's trip from Canada was a long one, but near the end of the journey, He found himself on a flight with the 2002 Peace Corp trainees on their way to Niger.
No, I had my own horse, and I did some of my work on horseback when I was in the area of Matame. I don't know. It took me back a bit. I mean, you can't help but pick up on that sort of underlying excitement or tension, a creative type of thing that they're almost emitting as they go through the last stages of arriving in Niger, and I certainly recall that feeling myself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Captain speaking. Hope you can have a choice of rest during this flight between Paris and Niamey. We'll begin our descent within 4 minutes.
Jim found himself buoyed by the excitement of the Peace Corps trainees on his flight. The morning after he arrived in Niamey, he was eager to leave the Nigerian capital for the rural areas of the country. It would be an 8-hour drive across Niger to Maradi and Zinder.
When we came out the first time in 1964, there were roughly, I would say, somewhere between 20 or 25 of us who were posted to locations from Madawa to Maradi to Zinder and near those centers. We're in Dogonduchi right now, which is not terribly far out of Niamey. We've been through Dosso, which is the first major center you hit on your way east. We'll now be, after this, we'll go through Birninkoni and Madawa and a couple of other smaller communities on the way to Maradi, which is a major center in Niger.
So how does it feel to be back in Niger?
I love it. It feels good. It feels comfortable. It's always kind of each time around, it's sort of a mystery how it is that I happen to be here again. But it always feels good. It feels like I belong. It's nice.
Does it feel as you get closer to your destination?
I just find myself getting more relaxed. The further out of Niamey we get on the road. I like Niamey well enough, but I think I'm more comfortable in the smaller centers and in the villages. And the further along we go on the road, the more it feels like I'm in the Niger that I knew way back when. The people are wonderful. The land, as marginal as it is for growing food crops, is beautiful and engaging. It's stark in many ways, but the people from our country, we sit and look at the ocean, or we sit and we look at the mountains. Here you look out at the expanses of the Sahel and the near desert, and it has that same kind of effect on me that looking out over an ocean or one of the Great Lakes has at home. So I love the topography. I enjoy the people tremendously. It somehow hooked me and kept its hook in all these years.
The next morning, Jim finds himself in Zinder, the place he was dropped off almost 40 years before. As he wanders around, the memories quickly come back.
No depot wasn't there, and none of these commercial buildings along that side of the road were there at all. It's all new in the last 35 to 40 years, and you have to get almost to about here to actually get a good view of the port.
The morning wears on. In many ways, Jim feels at home. He heads to the Care Niger office to meet women involved in a program called Madamasu Dubara. It's another microcredit program supported by Friends of Niger. As Jim enters the Care Niger office, he finds an economics class already underway for a group of village women. He heads to the village Friends of Niger supports. On the way, Jim stops in the village of Don Barteau. It's a village he worked in as a Peace Corps volunteer 40 years ago. As he drives through the town, he remembers what it was once like.
Most of these buildings weren't here. There's practically nothing on this side of the road.
Does it take you back?
A little. This all takes me back a little. The road wasn't paved then.
Yeah.
This was all a clay road. And when you got to about here, that was it. You wouldn't have been going any further that way. There was none of the village, that part of the village was here then. This store was here 38 years ago when I was here, and it was filled with a whole variety of local needed produce, things that weren't manufactured locally. The cooperative building and the store was attached to the larger efforts of the peanut marketing cooperative, which is what I worked at over here in the area immediately adjacent and to the north of the building.
Okay. It doesn't take long for Jim to be welcomed home to Don Barteau. While some things are better here, Jim quickly finds out that people in the area have become poorer, not richer, since his time in the village.
Well, I had hoped that there would have been some way to build on the economy that the market had provided. Not necessarily exactly the same stuff, but that the market had provided. And it sounds very much as if it's been a retrenchment economically. They do now grow sugarcane apparently in the market. Où est-ce qu'ils vendent le canne de sucre? Oh, vraiment?
He said that before they take it to Niamey, but now they take it to Zender and Maradi.
Oh, I think probably things are a little bit worse, and it is disappointing. 40 years is a long time, though, and it's not the only place in the world where things have gotten worse. People talked about it when we were there, and they kept calling it La Belle Époque, the wonderful period of time. What happened then, of course, was that the international market for peanuts fell, and Niger is at such sort of a marginal level of profitability anyhow for export, given transportation infrastructures and things like that, that once it went below a certain level, it was no longer really viable as an industrial crop in a manner of speaking. And once that was gone, then the raison d'etre, or the sort of the underpinning of the co-op, disappeared.
Jim says the increased poverty has led some Nigerians to lose hope.
What you get in effect is a culture of poverty who has come to feel it can't expect too much more than what it has. That needs to be shifted and changed because the resources, in fact, don't exist here. And it's going to have to be some kind of partnership thing that allows people to have access to resources and with it access to hope.
The sustainability of these initiatives will depend to a large extent to how much it affects the objective living conditions of the man in the street. If people's life change, if they have resources, I think there will be a better consciousness about the need to be more involved in developments in their country. But if things remain the same, people are just going to get apathetic, and I think that is one of the big problems in most West African countries. There is an apathy towards governance.
The priority is going to be to make the working culture coming back, to make people working. We should make some conditions available for people, and we should change the culture of people.
A transition from the culture of poverty is exactly the point behind the Care Niger project Jim stops by. He's taken to a small village where women have collectively saved their money through what is essentially a village-based credit union. It's a group that exists as a result of money from Friends of Niger.
CARE had completed the process of organizing new village groups in this area. When we received word that financing had arrived from Friends of Niger that would allow us to organize and train women from another village. For this reason, the women of this group call themselves Friends of Niger.
Malam Garbani.
The women of this village are quick to welcome Jim. They've expected his arrival. They're thrilled someone's come so far to meet them and to talk to them about their successes.
It was really important for them to know that somebody from somewhere else cared enough and was interested enough to actually come here and see what was happening so that people in other places might learn from what was happening here and benefit from it.
These are women who are very motivated by the project. We locate a village where we set up a type of credit union.
The women of this group are proud to show off their savings to Jim. For women in Niger to have been able to collect this much money is a great success. And their group isn't the only successful one.
Right now, all the village groups are more or less on their own. But the next level of training will soon begin. Representatives of the village groups will begin an exchange with providers of various services about village needs. The village groups will pay for services which are provided themselves.
This group of women credits Friends of Niger with their start. Jim soon learns they prepared a very special thank you for him.
Thanks is what it was. They kept saying the Mungode thing, which means we thank you. It's highly ironic, really, that this kind of phenomena should be emerging in the wake of the failure of the marketing co-op at Don Barteau.
His day had started with disappointment in Don Barteau. But Jim has found in these women something exciting.
They deposit their own savings from money they already have to generate the possibility of additional economic activity. And that's what's so hopeful about it. And if that's happening in 42 villages in this area, being driven by the women of this area, then I'm much more hopeful than I was after I left Don Barteau and seeing what had happened to the marketing cooperative, curiously enough, driven by men like me. So.
Do you feel better then?
Of course I feel better, yes, much better.
Once again, it's time for Jim to move on. He stops briefly in Madame, the village in which he once lived. Since he stopped earlier in nearby Don Barteau, there are plenty of people here to welcome him. Jim knew some of these people when they were kids, and they're eager to take him back to his old house.
There was two. There was me and a really tall guy, and we moved here 38 years ago, and we were here.
Again, it's time to move on. Jim has time for a local lunch in the village he once called home. He's joined by many people he once lived and worked with. Though he'd like to stay longer, Jim knows he needs to find the women with the ox carts. But before he leaves Matame, he stops in Conche to visit a friend from his 1997 trip, Munzo the master drum maker. It seems like the whole village turns out for an impromptu concert. Jim has to move on. As he gets closer to the villages Micah and Friends of Niger have placed ox carts in, Jim thinks about the program.
In a lot of the villages, there isn't an ox cart, or there isn't an ox cart that is available to do the kind of things that are being done by these groups essentially, and that is things like helping pregnant women get to a clinic, taking marketable products to a neighboring village rather than just selling them locally, etc. So it's an expansion of the economic activity and the provision of services that aren't available.
Jim arrives in Maradi late at night. Early the next morning, he finds Halima Mazo. She offers to take Jim to some local villages to meet women who use ox carts. It isn't long before Jim finds himself on a tour of many of the villages using ox carts Friends of Niger and Micah have provided. Jim decides to find out exactly how the ox carts are used.
It helps the women learn to read and write, to work at the market, and educate the women of the village.
They're using it actually in two ways, both of which they seem to value very highly. One is to reduce the workload for themselves of carrying heavy things on their heads or their backs. So they're using it for themselves, where they don't really earn money, and then renting it out to other people for tasks that they want done, where they pay for the service. So they're using it in two ways. And I hadn't really even thought in those terms, but that makes perfect sense, of course. Apparently the general practice is that the children, the younger people, walk with the oxen and cart. The women take care of the oxen, and they make the decisions around how it's going to be used, what the prices are. They own it, it's their cart, but during the day they're doing all the normal things and preparing food and things like that, so they have one or other or more of their children, in this case it's an older child, going out into the bush, walking alongside, in other words, the oxen and cart.
Halima Mazu says women of local villages see their lives change through their involvement in owning an ox cart.
Many women gain from the ox cart program because now they earn money and they can make some economic decisions of their own.
Halima Mazu says it's difficult for Nigerians to ask outsiders for help, but the need is great. She says help from Jim and Friends of Niger has already made a difference in the lives of women.
The Friends of Niger have been very important to the ox cart program. The help from Friends of Niger to the women is especially important because it gives women the means to purchase things needed for the household and for the children.
It is difficult to ask somebody to help you. But the situation is so hard, some families leave the village. When you know there is someone who could help you, you ask them.
When I go in the village, I talk with them. We talk about the project. They also told me what they want. But I told them that everything must be step by step.
I feel I can go back now to our board, I can go back now to our members, and in good faith say, not only did we have the right intent when we did this, but what kinds of things we hoped would happen are actually happening.
Is that they have the capacity, the confidence to take charge of their own affairs. And so it's a springboard for many others that aren't even necessarily in the area of microcredit, that aren't even necessarily in the area of economics, understand them. Community services, social services, education, a whole range of things. Once the process begins and people feel like they actually have some charge and some impact, then it can go wherever they want it to go.
Kimba says it's important for people to take charge of their own destinies. He says small projects allow local people to have control over what happens in their villages.
Big projects, government of United States or Canada or France, they give the money to government, but some people stole the money. But the microcredits, I think that obviously it is the way. It is the only way to change the condition of those people. It is really a war against poverty. It is a good weapon.
Madam Diada says it was important for Jim to come to Niger this year and to see what conditions are now like.
I want, any person, any organization who gives something to Micah to have a proof that what he gave has been used in the way it is supposed to be used. So Jim went to Niger and he saw the women and he talked to them.
It's a different kind of sensation, knowing that you're coming back to take a look at and talk with people about something that you've been directly involved in supporting rather than just coming back to visit. And it feels more like there's a relationship between that and what I did 35 years ago.
Starting the ox cart is just the beginning, but I know that we have many things in common and we see the things the same way. The Jim and I, we are going really to work hard, on different projects. Sometimes when I talk with Jim, I even forgot that he is not from Niger. Jim is just a brother from Niger.
As Jim prepares to leave Niger, he finds himself overcome by the inequities of the world.
Coming back 40 years later and seeing people as poorer than they were before, living in a society in which the major debate I hear most often is whether or not to get the second or third car an hour later. Can we get another snowmobile? How about the cottage? Our fourth cell phone, our second TV. And all those things are wonderful. And I have a lot of them myself, so I'm not a saint on these issues. But we have such tremendous resources, and they have grown and expanded over the last 40 years since I left Niger. And here, things were every bit of tough, it's not tougher than before. That's something I find frustrating. It seems to me we should be able to do better than that. It's not a matter of giving it away, but it seems to me that the relationship we have could be and should be more equitable. I've become increasingly convinced over the years that people need to play a more active and direct role in efforts of this kind. International poverty is too important an issue to be left in the hands of only of governments, and it's maybe time that ordinary people recommit to other ordinary people in more direct ways.
Back in Canada, Jim can enjoy the comforts of the developed world. But that doesn't diminish the hold Niger has over him. Jim's semi-retired, but his days are still filled with work. Now, it's work to help the people of Niger.
Maybe one of the things we can agree on, regardless of our different sets of beliefs, or our different value structures, or our different religious affiliations, or whatever the case may be, that one of the reasons for being here is to help each other through this thing. I think Friends of Niger and my involvement in Niger can be a way for me to do that with my life, and I find that satisfying.